The sun was a hammer over the Malpais, beating the iron-dark rock until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. Silas Blackwood rode with his hat pulled low, the brim casting a meager shadow that did little to cool the sweat beading on his temples. This was the edge of his land, the broken country where his vast, silver-bought ranch crumbled into the territory of ghosts and hard men. He wasn't a cattleman in the traditional sense. He hadn't inherited sprawling herds or a family name etched into the county's history. He had found a thick, glittering vein of silver in the heart of the Dragoon Mountains 10 years ago, and with that fortune, he had bought his solitude. He'd purchased the sprawling high lonesome ranch, a fortress of rock and pine that kept the world at a comfortable, resentful distance. The other ranchers, with their dusty cattle and generational pride, saw him as an upstart, a man whose wealth was born of luck, not labor. They didn't understand that the solitude was the entire point. He guided his buckskin, Ajax, through a narrow cut in the rock, the canyon walls rising like scorched cathedral spires on either side. The silence was absolute, broken only by the clink of Ajax's shoes on stone and the creak of worn leather. It was a silence he usually cherished, a balm against the noise of memory. But today it felt different. It felt watchful. He reined in, his hand resting instinctively on the worn stock of the Winchester in its scabbard. His gaze swept the rim of the canyon above. Nothing, just the endless, indifferent blue of the sky and the slow circle of a hawk. Still, the feeling persisted, a prickle on his skin that had kept him alive more than once. It was the smell that hit him first, carried on a low, hot breeze that funneled through the canyon. It was the coppery, cloying scent of blood, too heavy to be a coyote's kill. He dismounted, his movements economical and quiet, a habit from years spent listening to the land. He pulled the Winchester free, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hands. Ajax stood fast, his ears swiveling, nostrils flared. Silas moved forward, his boots making no sound on the sandy wash of the canyon floor. He rounded a jagged outcrop of granite and stopped. They were huddled together in the scant shade of a mesquite tree, its thorny branches offering pathetic protection from the brutal sun. Two women. Apache. They were impossibly tall, even slumped against the rock, with the long-limbed grace of desert predators brought low. Twins, he realized, his mind struggling to process the symmetry of their faces, the identical fall of their straight, black hair, matted now with dust and blood. They were magnificent and broken. One of them had a crude, bloody bandage wrapped around her thigh, the fabric soaked through. The other's arm was held at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly bruise was spreading across her cheekbone, her eyes swollen shut. Their deerskin dresses were torn and stained, their bodies etched with the violence of a desperate flight. They looked barely conscious, their chests rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. He saw the tracks then, leading away from them. The deep impressions of shod horses, 3, maybe 4 riders, and the scuffed, drag marks of a struggle. Bounty hunters. He'd heard the whispers in the town of Redemption, whispers of a high price on any Apache caught off the reservation, a price that drew the lowest kind of men like flies to a corpse. These women were not warriors raiding a settlement. They were fugitives running for their lives. Silas's heart, a thing he'd long considered a dormant, useless organ, gave a hard, painful thump against his ribs. The world saw him as a man apart, a rich recluse content in his mountain fortress. They didn't know about the wife and daughter he'd buried after a cholera outbreak swept through their mining camp, long before the silver made him wealthy. They didn't know that his solitude was a penance, a shield against the pain of ever losing anyone again. To help these women was to invite that pain back into his life. The men who had done this would not give up easily. They would track them. They would bring their violence to his door, to the one place on earth he had crafted to be free of it. He could ride away, leave them to the sun and the coyotes. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. No one would ever know. He looked at them again, at the way they were pressed together even in their delirium, a mirror image of shared agony. One of them stirred, a low moan escaping her cracked lips. Her open eye, a sliver of dark obsidian, found him. There was no fear in it, not anymore. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion, the look of a soul that had fought until it had nothing left. In that gaze, he saw not a savage, as the men in town would call her, but a person pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. He saw the ghost of his own wife's final hours, the same surrender to overwhelming pain. The decision was not a decision at all. It was an inevitability, a pull from a part of himself he thought had died and turned to dust. Cursing his own weakness, his own damn fool heart, he slung the Winchester over his shoulder. He unhooked his canteen and knelt between them. "Water," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He brought the mouth of the canteen to the lips of the woman who had looked at him. She drank, her throat working convulsively. He then moved to her sister, gently tilting her head to help her swallow the life-giving liquid. Her swollen eye fluttered open. It was a mirror of her sister's, the same shape, the same depth. He was caught between two identical gazes, two silent, suffering souls. They watched him, their shared look a mixture of dazed confusion and a flicker of something else. A question. He had no answer for them, only an action. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous in the vast silence. "My ranch is close. It's safe." Getting them onto Ajax was a slow, agonizing process. They were taller than him, and even weakened, their bodies were dense with muscle. He was strong, his wealth not having softened him, but lifting them was a trial. He got the one with the injured leg up first, positioning her sideways in the saddle. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain when her leg was jostled, and her sister, despite her own injuries, tried to push him away, a flare of protective fire in her one good eye. "Easy," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "I'm helping. Easy now." He spoke to them as he would a spook horse, the tone more important than the words. He finally managed to get the second woman settled in front of her sister, her back resting against the saddle horn. They filled the saddle, a tableau of suffering and resilience. Ajax, bless his steady heart, stood like a rock, sensing the fragility of his cargo. Silas took the reins, his own body aching with the effort. He gave them one last look, their dark heads bowed together, their breathing still shallow. The men who hunted them would be back. He knew it with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut. By taking these women, he had declared war. He had painted a target on the high lonesome. He started walking, leading the horse out of the canyon of death and towards the faint, distant promise of his mountain sanctuary, the hammer of the sun beating down on them all. The journey back was a silent, grim pilgrimage. The heat of the day bled into the cool of the evening, the sky turning from a searing cobalt to a soft, bruised purple. Silas walked, his boots sinking into the dust, every step a conscious effort. He could feel the weight of the women through the reins, a constant, heavy reminder of the choice he had made. He did not let himself regret it. Regret was a luxury he had given up long ago. Now, there was only the task at hand. Survive. Protect. He navigated the familiar game trails and hidden paths that snaked up into the foothills of the dragoons. These were the shortcuts no one else knew, the secret arteries of his land. As they climbed, the air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The harshness of the lowlands gave way to the protective embrace of the mountains. He glanced back at his passengers. They were slumped against each other, their faces pale in the twilight, but they were enduring. He saw the sister with the broken arm occasionally reach out a hand to steady the other, a small, instinctive gesture of care that spoke volumes. They were a unit, two halves of a whole, and their survival was a shared endeavor. It was well after dark when the ranch came into view. It wasn't a sprawling collection of barns and bunkhouses like a typical cattle spread. It was a single, large house built of thick pine logs and river stone, with a sturdy barn and a corral set a short distance away. It was nestled in a high meadow, surrounded on three sides by sheer granite cliffs and on the fourth by a dense forest of ponderosa pine. It was a fortress by design, built for defense and isolation. A lamp burned in a single window, a golden beacon he'd left for himself that now seemed to be welcoming them all home. The effort of getting them down from the horse was even greater than getting them up. Their bodies were stiff with pain and exhaustion. He half-carried, half-dragged them one by one into the house, their deerskin dresses whispering against the wooden floors. He laid them down on the thick bearskin rug in front of the great stone fireplace, the heart of the home. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and the lonely bachelor existence he lived. Now, the sharp, metallic smell of their blood and the scent of wild sage and dust from their clothes mingled with it, changing the character of the space entirely. For a moment, he simply stood over them, breathing heavily. The sheer, startling beauty of them, even in their broken state, was arresting. They were not delicate. They were carved from the same hard, resilient materials as the mountains themselves. Their faces, even slack with pain, held a fierce dignity. He shook himself from his reverie. There was work to do. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding fresh logs until a steady, warm blaze pushed back the shadows and the chill of the mountain night. He lit several more lamps, flooding the large room with a soft, steady glow. Then, he turned his attention to their wounds. He was no doctor, but years of solitude and self-reliance had taught him a thing or two about mending flesh and bone. He brought a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and the small wooden box where he kept his medical supplies: carbolic acid, bandages, a needle and gut suture, and a bottle of laudanum. He started with the woman with the injured leg. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. "This will hurt," he said softly. "I need to clean it." She watched him with that one open eye, her sister's gaze equally fixed on him from where she lay. There was no trust in their eyes, yet only a wary, animal stillness. He gently cut away the filthy, makeshift bandage. The wound beneath was ugly, a deep, ragged gash on her outer thigh. It wasn't a bullet wound, he realized. It was from a knife. A defensive wound, perhaps. It was inflamed and weeping, the edges raw and angry. He cleaned it as gently as he could, flushing it with water and then dabbing it with the stinging acid. She flinched violently, her whole body tensing, a sharp hiss of breath escaping her lips, but she made no other sound. Her sister, however, let out a low growl, a protective rumble deep in her chest, and tried to sit up, her face a mask of fury despite her own pain. "Nita, no," the first one whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. It was the first time he had heard either of them speak a name. The sister, Nita, subsided, but her glare never left Silas's hands. He worked quickly, his fingers surprisingly nimble. He stitched the wound closed with tight, clean sutures, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he applied a salve and wrapped it in clean linen bandages. He moved to Nita next. "Your arm," he said simply. He examined it, his touch firm but careful. It was a clean break of the ulna. He'd set bones in livestock before, and once on himself after a fall. "I have to set this. It will be the worst pain yet. Do you understand?" Nita just stared at him, her jaw tight. Her sister, the one with the sutured leg, pushed herself up on her elbows. "Shima," she said, her voice stronger now. "My name is Shima." She looked at her sister. "We understand." Silas nodded, appreciating the directness. He gave Nita a strip of thick leather to bite down on. "Shima, you'll need to hold her shoulder. Hold her down as hard as you can." Shima shuffled closer, her face grim. She placed both her hands on Nita's shoulder, her knuckles white. Silas took a deep breath, positioned his hands on Nita's forearm, and pulled. There was a sickening, wet pop as the bones slid back into place. Nita screamed into the leather, a muffled, guttural sound of pure agony. Her whole body arched, fighting against Shima's hold. Silas worked without pause, his face a mask of concentration as he quickly bound the arm with wooden splints and strips of cloth, immobilizing it against her body. When it was over, a heavy silence fell, broken only by Nita's ragged, panting breaths. Sweat poured down Silas's face. He felt drained, as if he had taken on a portion of their pain himself. He offered Nita a dose of laudanum, and she took it without argument, her body trembling with shock. He gave a smaller dose to Shima for the pain in her leg. He retreated to the kitchen area of the large room, leaving them by the fire. His hand was shaking slightly. He hadn't been this close to another person's suffering in a decade. He put a pot of broth on the stove, the simple, domestic task away to steady his nerves. While it heated, he sat at his heavy oak table, the one he had built himself, and began cleaning his rifle. The familiar, methodical process of oiling the steel and checking the action was a comfort. The men who had done this would come. The knife wound on Shima's leg, the broken arm. It was personal, cruel. This wasn't just about a bounty. It was about subjugation, about hatred, and those men would not like that their prey had been taken from them. They would see it as a challenge. When the broth was ready, he brought 2 bowls over to the fireplace. Nita was already succumbing to the laudanum, her breathing evening out as she slipped into a drugged sleep. Shima, however, was awake, her dark eyes following his every move. She had propped herself up against a rolled-up blanket. He handed her a bowl. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt like static electricity passed between them. Her skin was cool. She took the bowl and ate slowly, deliberately, as if refamiliarizing her body with the act of nourishment. They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. The house, which had always felt so large and empty, now felt occupied. It felt alive. Why? Shima's voice was low, but it cut through the quiet. Silas looked up from his own untouched bowl. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. I don't know, he answered honestly. He looked at her, then at her sleeping sister. No one should be left to die in the sun. She held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She seemed to be searching for something in his face, a lie, a hidden motive. Whatever she found, it seemed to satisfy her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she finished her broth, set the empty bowl aside, and lay back down, her eyes closing. But he knew she wasn't sleeping. She was resting. She was gathering her strength. And Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the mountain air, that they would all need it. The peace of the high lonesome had been broken, and the cost of his compassion was yet to be paid. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, a routine of healing and waiting. The high lonesome ranch, once a bastion of Silas's solitude, became a silent infirmary. He moved about the house with a renewed sense of purpose, his life no longer defined by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the needs of the 2 women recovering by his hearth. He changed their bandages, brought them food and water, and kept the fire fed. He spoke little, and they spoke even less, but a language of gestures and shared glances began to form in the quiet spaces between them. Shima was the first to regain a measure of her strength. Her leg wound, stitched and kept clean, began to heal without infection. Within a few days, she was able to limp around the large room, her hand trailing along the walls or the backs of furniture for support. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace, exploring the confines of her sanctuary. She would stand for long periods by the large window that overlooked the valley, her gaze distant, scanning the horizon. She was a sentinel, even in her wounded state. Nita's recovery was slower. The pain from her broken arm was a constant, and the laudanum kept her in a state of drowsy lethargy for the first few days. But Silas could see the fierce spirit in her warring against the drug's haze. She would refuse the medicine until the pain became unbearable, her jaw set in a line of stubborn endurance. During her waking hours, she would watch Silas with an unnerving intensity. Her gaze was different from Shima's. Where Shima's was watchful and assessing, Nita's was sharp, almost confrontational, as if she were dissecting his every motive. Silas did his best to ignore their scrutiny, focusing on his chores. He mucked out the barn, tended to Ajax, and worked on reinforcing the heavy wooden shutters on the windows, his hands busy while his mind raced. He knew the bounty hunters, led by the man he now thought of as Cain, a name he'd overheard in town attached to rumors of brutality, would not have given up. They would have found the tracks leading away from the canyon. They would have followed them as far as the rocky terrain allowed. Now, they would be circling, gathering information, trying to determine where their quarry had vanished. His ranch was isolated, but not invisible. They would learn of the reclusive rich man in the mountains. It was only a matter of time. One afternoon, Silas was mending a bridle in the main room, the smell of leather oil filling the air. Shima limped over and stood beside his table. She watched him for a full minute, her silence a heavy presence. Then, she reached out and picked up a torn leather strap he had set aside. Her fingers, long and nimble, began to work at it, testing the strength, feeling the texture. She then pointed to the awl and waxed thread on his table. Silas pushed them towards her without a word. She sat down on the floor, her back straight, and began to stitch the strap with a skill that far surpassed his own. Her stitches were small, tight, and perfectly even. It was a simple act, but it was a profound shift. She was no longer just a patient. She was contributing, participating in the life of the house. She was mending what was broken. Later that day, Nita, propped up against the hearth with her arm in its sling, spoke to him directly for the first time since he had set the bone. Her voice was stronger, clearer. "You have other guns?" The question was blunt, devoid of pleasantry. Silas stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "I do. Show us." He hesitated for only a second. He had made his choice in the canyon. There was no sense in half measures now. He went to the large, locked chest in his bedroom and returned with 2 Colt Peacemakers and a double-barreled shotgun. He laid them on the table, along with several boxes of cartridges. The metallic scent of gun oil and powder joined the other smells in the room. Shima stopped her mending, her eyes fixed on the weapons. Nita pushed herself into a more upright position, her good eye gleaming with a cold fire. She nodded towards the shotgun. "That one. For me." Even with one arm, her intent was clear. Shima picked up one of the Colts. She balanced in her hand, her grip sure and familiar. She checked the action with an expert flick of her wrist. These were not women unaccustomed to violence. They were survivors. They had fought before, and they were preparing to fight again. In that moment, Silas felt a surge of grim relief. He was not alone in this. The next few days saw a subtle but significant change in the household dynamic. They were no longer just his patients. They were his partners. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the weapons laid out on the bearskin rug between them, cleaning and oiling them in a silent, shared ritual. Shima, despite her limp, began to help in the kitchen, grinding coffee or chopping vegetables with a quiet efficiency. Nita, unable to do much with her arm, became the lookout. She would sit by the window for hours, her gaze never wavering from the single, winding track that led up to the ranch. One evening, as a storm gathered over the mountains, the wind howling around the corners of the house like a hungry wolf, Silas found Shima standing on the porch, staring out into the churning gray clouds. The air was electric with ozone. "They're coming," she said, not looking at him. It wasn't a question. "I know," he replied, standing beside her. The valley below was lost in shadow and mist. "There are 4 of them," she continued, her voice a low murmur against the wind. "The leader is a man with a scarred face. He smells of cheap whiskey and cruelty." She touched the healing wound on her thigh. His knife was dull. The cold, matter-of-fact way she said it sent a chill down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the coming storm. "Nita's arm. He did that," Shima went on, her voice tightening. "He was holding her down, and the others. They were laughing. We ran. I cut the saddle girth on one of their horses. It bought us time." She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the turbulent sky. "They will not expect us to fight back. They think we are just women. They think you are just a rich man, soft from easy living." "Let them," Silas said, his voice hard. He had spent 10 years building this fortress, not just against the world, but against his own grief. He would not see it fall to men like that. That night, the storm broke with a primal fury. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the log house. It was a fitting soundtrack to their preparations. They barred the doors and shuttered the windows, plunging the house into a warm, lamplit cocoon against the tempest outside. They laid out the guns, ammunition, and canteens of water. There was no fear in the room, only a tense, focused readiness. Silas looked at the two women, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Shima, with a Colt tucked in her waistband, moved with a controlled, fluid purpose. Nita, with the heavy shotgun resting across her lap, her good hand stroking the stock, looked like an avenging goddess. They were no longer the broken figures he had found in the canyon. They had reclaimed themselves. The fire of their spirit, which had been banked to a mere ember, was now a roaring blaze. He realized with a jolt that the emptiness inside him, the vast, silent cavern of loss he had carried for a decade, was gone. It had been filled by this shared purpose, by the quiet strength of these two women. He was no longer just protecting them. They were protecting each other. They had, without ever speaking of it, formed a tribe of 3 against the coming darkness. The bounty hunters thought they were coming for a prize. They had no idea they were walking into a war. And as the thunder rattled the windows, Silas Blackwood, the man who had bought his solitude with silver, prepared to defend his newfound family with steel. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and unervingly quiet. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of wet pine and earth. In the pre-dawn gloom, Nita, still at her post by the window, spoke a single word, her voice cutting through the stillness like a shard of glass. "Here." Silas, who had been dozing in a chair with a Winchester across his lap, was instantly awake. He moved to the window beside her, peering through a narrow slit in the shutter. 4 riders were emerging from a tree line at the edge of the meadow, moving slowly, cautiously. Even from this distance, he could make out the leader, a burly man on a big roan, his face a pale smudge in the dim light. Jedediah Kane. Shima came to stand behind them, the Colt heavy in her hand. The 3 of them stood in silence, watching the slow approach of their fate. "They'll try the front door first," Silas murmured, his voice low. "They'll act friendly, ask for water, a hot meal. They think I'm a fool." "We are not fools," Shima said, her hand resting for a moment on her sister's shoulder. "Nita, you take the loft window," Silas instructed. "It gives you a clear line of fire on the porch and the front of the barn. Shima, stay with me. Cover the side windows. Don't fire unless I do, or unless they make a move for the house." They moved to their positions without a word, a well-oiled machine born of necessity. Silas watched through the shutter as the 4 men dismounted, leaving their horses ground-hitched near the corral. They swaggered towards the house, their confidence an insult. Kane stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding on the wood. The other 3 fanned out, their hands hovering near their pistols. "Hello, the house." Kane's voice was oily, laced with a false congeniality. "Got a lost traveler here, hoping for a cup of coffee to warm his bones." Silas remained silent. He could feel the tension in the room coiling tighter and tighter. He could hear Nita shift her position in the loft above, the faint scrape of the shotgun barrel on the window frame. "Ain't very neighborly of you." Kane called out, his tone hardening. "We know you're in there, Blackwood, and we know you've got something that belongs to us. 2 Apache squaws. Government wants him back. There's a reward. We can split it, make this easy." "The only thing you'll get here is a grave," Silas called back, his voice flat and cold. "Turn around and ride out. This is your only warning." A moment of silence, and then Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have it your way, rich man." The world exploded in sound and violence. Kane kicked the door, the heavy oak shuddering but holding firm. The other 3 men drew their pistols and opened fire, bullets thudding into the log walls and shattering the glass behind the shutters. Silas fired back, his Winchester barking, the shot aimed not to kill, but to drive them from the porch. One of the men yelped and scrambled back, clutching his arm. From the loft, Nita's shotgun roared, a deafening blast that sent a spray of buckshot into the wooden porch right where Kane had been standing. He leaped back with a curse, splinters flying. Shima, from the side window, fired the Colt twice, forcing a man who was trying to circle the house back into the open. They were pinned down. The initial, arrogant assault had failed. The bounty hunters took cover behind the water trough and the corners of the barn, surprised by the ferocity of the defense. A grim firefight settled in, the crack of pistols and the boom of the Winchester echoing across the high meadow. Silas fought with a cold, detached efficiency, his mind focused entirely on angles, cover, and the number of shots fired. He was a good shot, patient and precise. But the attackers were desperate and greedy. One of them made a run for the barn, clearly intending to set it on fire and smoke them out. Silas saw him break from cover. He drew a bead, but before he could fire, Shima's Colt cracked from the other window. The man stumbled, spun around, and fell face-first into the mud, his run finished forever. A cold knot of fear tightened in Silas's gut. This was no longer a warning. It was a fight to the death. Shima had just killed a man to protect their home. He glanced at her. Her face was pale but resolute, her jaw set. She reloaded the pistol with steady hands, her eyes never leaving the windows. The fight raged on. A bullet punched through the shutter near Silas's head, showering his face with splinters. He ducked back, his heart pounding. They were trapped, and the attackers were not giving up. Kane was screaming orders, his voice raw with fury. They were trying to concentrate their fire on the loft window, trying to silence Nita's shotgun. "I'm going out," Silas said, the decision forming with stark clarity. "They're spread out. If I can get to the rocks behind the barn, I can get a crossfire on them. I can end this." "No," Shima said instantly, her voice sharp. "You will die. If we stay here, we'll run out of ammunition. They'll burn the barn and the house. We have no choice." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Cover me." Before she could argue further, he moved. He slipped out the back door, a small, sturdy exit that led towards the sheer cliffs. He ran low and fast, the damp ground sucking at his boots. He expected a shot to ring out at any second, a bullet to find his back. But the firing from the front of the house intensified. Shima and Nita were laying down a furious curtain of covering fire, drawing all the attention, giving him the precious seconds he needed. He reached the jumble of granite boulders at the edge of the woods behind the barn. His lungs burned, but he was safe for the moment. He peered around the edge of a rock. From here, he had a perfect, flanking view of the two remaining bounty hunters, who were crouched behind the water trough, reloading and firing at the house, completely unaware of his new position. Kane was further back, near the horses, directing them. Silas took a steadying breath, raised the Winchester, and sighted down the barrel. He was not a murderer, but these men had brought death to his door. They had brutalized the women under his protection. There was no mercy left in him. His first shot was clean and true. One of the men by the trough slumped forward without a sound. The other spun around in confusion, his eyes wide with panic as he tried to locate the new threat. Silas's second shot caught him in the chest. He fell backward, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the sky. Silence. The sudden absence of gunfire was deafening. There was only one left. Kane. Silas saw him by the horses, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had lost. His men were dead, his bounty was lost, and he was exposed. He looked at the house, then in the direction of Silas's shots, his mind clearly racing. Then his eyes fell on Ajax and the other horses in the corral. A new, malicious idea lit his face. If he couldn't have the bounty, he would take something else. He started running towards the corral, pulling his knife. "No," Silas breathed. He broke cover, running to cut Kane off. It was a foolish, impulsive move, but the thought of that man harming his animals, his one constant companion for so long, was unbearable. Kane saw him coming and changed direction, charging at Silas with the knife held low. The fight was suddenly primitive, personal. Silas didn't have time to raise his rifle. He used it as a club, swinging the heavy stock to parry Kane's first wild slash. The two men crashed together, grappling in the mud. Kane was bigger, heavier, and fueled by a cornered animal's fury. He grunted, trying to bring the knife to bear. Silas fought back with a desperate strength, his hands locked on Cain's wrist. They slipped and fell, wrestling for control of the blade. Silas could feel the man's hot, whiskey-sour breath on his face. He could see the mindless cruelty in his eyes. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Shima. She was limping, running from the house, her face a mask of primal fury. She held no gun. In her hand was the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She reached them just as Cain managed to twist the knife, its tip grazing Silas's ribs. She didn't hesitate. She raised the poker high and brought it down with all her strength on the back of Cain's head. The sound was a sickening, wet crunch. Cain's body went rigid, then limp, his dead weight collapsing on top of Silas. Silas shoved the body off him and lay panting on the ground, the metallic taste of blood and fear in his mouth. The world was spinning. Shima stood over him, the poker still in her hand, her chest heaving. Nita was on the porch, the shotgun held at her side, her face grim. It was over. The meadow was silent again, littered with the bodies of their attackers. The morning sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the scene of carnage. They had won. They had survived. That night, the house was a pocket of warmth and light in the vast, dark wilderness. The bodies of the bounty hunters had been dragged into the woods, a grim task performed in near silence. The storm had passed, leaving a sky brilliant with stars. Inside, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The smell of gun oil was gone, replaced by the scent of pine and brewing coffee. Silas sat in his worn armchair, a fresh bandage wrapped around his ribs where Cain's knife had cut him. The wound was shallow, a final, petty insult from a dead man. He felt an exhaustion so profound it settled in his bones, heavier than any physical labor he had ever known. But it was not the lonely exhaustion he was used to. It was a shared weariness, a communal quiet after the storm. Shima sat on the bearskin rug, tending to her sister. She was gently rewrapping the splints on Nita's arm, her movements deft and tender. Nita, her face pale, but her eyes clear and sharp, watched her sister's hands. The shotgun was propped against the hearth, a silent guardian. They had not spoken much since the fight. There was nothing to say. The events of the day had spoken for them. They had fought as one, bled as one, survived as one. When Shima was finished, she didn't move away. She sat back on her heels, her gaze finding Silas's across the firelit space. Nita looked at him too. The intensity of their combined stare was a physical force. It wasn't hostile, nor was it questioning. It was something else entirely, something deep and solemn that he couldn't name. Shima moved from her position and came to kneel on the rug beside his chair. Nita, with some effort, shifted to kneel on his other side. They flanked him, their presence both comforting and incredibly intimidating. The firelight played across their strong, symmetrical features, highlighting the proud line of their jaws, the depth of their dark eyes. He could feel the warmth radiating from their bodies. The vast, empty room suddenly felt very small, very full. Silas's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his bruised ribs. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was a moment of immense significance. This was a ceremony of some kind, a conclusion he did not understand. Shima reached out, her cool fingers gently touching the back of his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a gesture of grounding, of connection. On his other side, Nita, with her good hand, did the same. He was anchored between them, a circuit of touch completed. They were silent for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. Silas did not pull away. He sat perfectly still, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the women beside him. He felt as if he were being weighed and measured, his soul laid bare in the flickering light. Then Shima leaned closer, her voice a low, soft whisper, meant only for him, yet spoken with the weight of a sacred vow. "We have no tribe," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Our people are scattered or dead. The world has no place for us." She paused, and Nita leaned in from the other side, her voice a mirror of her sister's, a perfect harmony of sound and intent. "You have no tribe," Nita whispered, her words brushing against his skin. "You are a man alone in a fortress of ghosts." Their words were true. They struck him with the force of a physical blow, laying his lonely existence bare. He had built this ranch to keep the world out, but in doing so, he had built himself a prison. Shima's fingers tightened slightly on his hand. "You fought for us. You bled with us. You did not run." Nita's voice followed, seamless. "We fought for you. We bled with you. We did not run." They pulled back slightly, their identical, serious faces turned to him. The firelight caught the moisture in their eyes. This was not about gratitude. It was far deeper than that. It was about recognition. They saw him, the man beneath the wealth and the solitude. And he, in turn, saw them, the fierce, resilient souls beneath the scars and the suffering. Then came the words that would forever alter the geography of his world. It was Shima who spoke them, but he could feel Nita's silent assent, her complete unity with the statement. Her whisper was so soft, it was almost a thought, a breath of profound vulnerability and staggering strength. "We want you," she whispered. Nita's voice joined hers, a soft echo that was also an origin. Together, the word hung in the air between them, shimmering with a multitude of meanings. It was not a proposition of the flesh, though that might be part of it in time. It was a proposition of the soul. It was an offering. It was a claiming. It was the founding of a new tribe, a tribe of three, forged in the crucible of violence and survival. They were asking him to be their home, just as he had given them a home. They were offering to be his family, to fill the echoing spaces in his heart. They were two halves of a whole, and they were inviting him into their circle to make it complete. Silas looked from Shima's earnest face to Nita's equally open expression. He saw his future there, reflected in their dark eyes. A future not of lonely silence, but of shared breaths. A future not of defending an empty fortress, but of building a life. A life of hardship, certainly, with a world that would not understand. But a life of connection, of loyalty, of belonging. The rich cowboy, the man who thought he had everything because he had silver, realized he had been impoverished his entire life. True wealth was this bond, this quiet, fierce loyalty. He slowly, deliberately, turned his hands over and laced his fingers with theirs. He did not speak. He did not need to. His answer was in his touch, in the way he met their gaze without flinching. In the quiet of the mountain night, surrounded by the ghosts of the men they had defeated, a new family was born. The High Lonesome Ranch was no longer a monument to solitude. It was a home, and as the fire burned low, Silas Blackwood knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would never be alone again.